In this video, we're gonna learn how to create session where the server will start a session and the client will join the session. Now, luckily NetSync have the default network standard that we can use. So let's try to create empty here and then add the component for network, add the component of game starter. Now here we go, we have a lot of properties that we need to fill in. So the first one is the sandbox prefab. So Sandbox is the manager for the session, so it's responsible for executing the update loops for our game. However, why is it called Sandbox? It's called Sandbox because it's some kind of playground that we can test on. But don't worry, the name Sandbox, or we can say it's like a session starter for our game. So now let's create a new object here and let's call it a network sandbox. Add the network sandbox component here, and then we're gonna add it as our prefab. Now we have made our project structure here, and let's create a new folder here. I'm gonna call it prefabs, and in the prefabs we're gonna create another folder called session. So this folder is responsible for session management, so we're gonna add here for our network sandbox prefab, and then we're gonna delete this, and then we're gonna add this to here. And we're also going to rename this to game start. Now it asks for transport. Now transport are the manager that responsible how it will transmit the data to the client. So now there are a lot of transport, and by default we are using the LightNet library. You can see the LightNet library in this GitHub page. So it's a UDP library for C#. Now, this transport is using UDP. Now, if you want to create a transport, for example, we want to use TCP or we want to use for the WebGL, we can create our own transport. But for now, we're going to use the LightNet library because we're going to build for a desktop game. Next up, we have modes. So modes we want to start as server or as a client, or we can start as a multiple peers. Multiple peers meaning that we can start a server and multiple clients. And then we also have auto start, auto connect, and port and server IP address. Now we're going to talk about port. So anything that is network related that we want to expose to the internet, we must assign the port. Now let's take a look at this illustration. So we have a client 1 and client 2 and a server with this data. So client 1 will have a port of these, client 2 have a port of this, and the server have the IP and port of this. So in order for the client to connect the server, the client needs to know what IP and port the server is running at. So when we are trying to connect in the low level of programming, we want to put the IP and the port. So let's say we are going to access, hey, I want to connect with you. I know your information, the IP is here and the port is this. And then later on, the server will say, all right, I acknowledge your request, your connection request, and I see that you are using port at this. Now, this port doesn't really matter. This port on client do not matter most of the time. So we only need to care about these server IP and port. Now, there's one thing that we need to know about. When a server running on the same IP, they cannot use the same port. So let's say we are running the port of 777, and this when we're starting a session on this, it will throw an error. So we have to try to change the port. Let's just 8888. Now let's get back to Unity and talk about the fields that we're going to fill in. So now let's leave the rest to use this one. We're going to use the mode for multiple peers because we want to try to simulate a server and a client. Let's use the mode for server, and we're just going to ignore this because we don't use multiple peers mode, and we're just going to ignore the port for now. And let's try to build our game. So we're going to create a build here, and let's try to create build and then select folders. So we're going to wait up for a moment. So now we have finally created our first build. Before running up the build, we want to go to the player settings, and then we're going to go to resolution and change our full screen mode to Windows, and we're gonna make the resolution much smaller. Let's say 640 and 480. And then let's try to run our build. Now the build is done. Let's try to run our build, and we have these properties for now. So let's try to run a client on this small window. Meanwhile, for this will be the host. So let's try to play run server, and in here it said that server started on 38785. Now let's try to go to here and then click on run client. And there may be a little bit some Windows security because we are trying to access a network stuff. Just gonna allow that. There's nothing need to worry about. In the server log, there's a log indicating the client from a random part that is generated from Netic that we don't need to worry about has connected. Now, to this info much clear, we can go to Netic and go to settings and then drag it over here. Now there are settings and sandboxes. So settings, we're gonna ignore them for now. We're just gonna need to do the sandboxes. And in here, we are running as a server, and this server has indicated that there is one client connected, which is this window. And we can also the bandwidth in and out in kilobyte per second. And we can also shut down Netic by this button or this button. Now, if we close this, let's say we disconnect, and there's no data transmit anymore. Now, this is just a simple session starter by Netic. Now, because we have understand how to create a session, now let's try to create a empty player. So let's try to create a player prefab. So let's try to create our 3D object here. We're gonna name it, let's create the capsule here. And then we're gonna add a network object. So anything that is network related objects require to have component of network object. So these settings, we don't need to worry about these settings now. And then we're gonna rename this to player, and then we're gonna add to it our prefabs. So we're gonna create a new folder, let's call it gameplay, and then add another folder, call it player. And let's add our player to the project. There we go. And then we're just gonna remove this player. We're gonna create a new script. Let's call it match manager. And then we're gonna create a new script. Let's go call it match manager. And then we're gonna open it up on Visual Studio. Now, there's a little bit a Unity issue currently that script templates will not work if we add a C# script using the add component button. It only works if you use the create C# script. Now that is unfortunate, but don't worry. So we're just gonna open this up. We're gonna delete this line and then add our namespace, which is the end shooter. And then we're gonna add much more detailed namespace here. So match manager is for our gameplay. And then I'm gonna call it match. And now we need to derive from something to listen. We want to change the class to network events listener, which is this one. And from this, we can see there are a lot of methods that we can use. So when I type override in Visual Studio, there are a lot of callbacks that we can use on startup, shutdown, on-set load, and those kind of stuff. We just need to use the on client connected. So this callback called on the server when a specific client has connected. So from this, we can know if a client has connected to the session. Now we need to create a field to fill out the prefab. So let's create a serialized field, private, a network object of player prefab. And then we're gonna spawn the object. Now, we cannot use the Unity instantiate to make the object sync across the network. We need to use the Netic one, which is the network sandbox. So we can use sandbox dot instantiate this. Now it requires a game object prefab, position, and rotation. Now we can add our player prefab. However, it doesn't accept network object So we can use the game object here, and then we're going to use the vector tree position, which is, let's say, empty position and empty rotation. That's it. Because it's only called for client, whenever the server starts a session, it will not spawn a character for itself. Now, to do that, we can use override onScene_Loaded. In here, we want to spawn the player character for server only. So we're going to use if sandbox.isServer return, and add a exclamation point here. So basically, if we are playing the session as a client, we do not want to execute this. So we can use sandbox.instantiate the same line, which is the here. So we didn't copy and paste over here, and I'm going to go get back to Unity. And then we're going to add our player prefab. So go to our prefabs folder, add over here, and then let's try to play and then start a session. And here we go. We have our player here. Now we can see that the network object is also here, and we can see several info here, like in the prefab ID, scene ID, network ID, and some kind of stuff. Now let's try to see it from the client POV. So let's try to build the game by using Control B. So in here, let's start a server, and then from here we can start as a client. Now it said it is connected, and we can see there's a server connection and one client is connected. And when we go to scene, there are two player objects going on. Now we can move here, right? So this one probably ours. Meanwhile, this one is the client. So however, whenever I move this object, it is not seen on the client POV. So after changing our parent class to network events listener, let's look at the methods that we are going to use. So first off, we have the onClients connected. So these will be only called for the server, and it here has a tips which is called on the server when a specific client has connected. So if you want to spawn a player for the client, we can use this method. So let's say a sandbox dot. Now we cannot use Unity default instantiate because the object won't be synced across the network. So what we are going to use is sandbox dot network instantiate. So we're going to use this function, and let's create a field first for our game object. Let's create a serialized field attribute, private, a network object of player prefab. And then let's just put it here. And it also asks for a position. So let's say at a empty position, which is vector3.0, and empty rotation, quaternion.identity. And it also asks for network player and a lot of stuff. We're going to ignore that for now. That we're just gonna fill in the here, which is client. Why do we put clients here? So it's basically said like who owns this object. It doesn't have the authority to the states, but have the authority of sending inputs. So the server will spawn the object and assigning, hey client, this is your object. You can control this object. And that's why we are feeding the parameter of this client. And however, in here that it is a network player, but we are feeding a network connection. But don't worry, because network connection is a network player. And I'm just going to close that. And then there's also another error here because network instantiate only accepts a game object. So I'm just going to change it to game object. And then just going to go back to Unity, go to the match manager, and just drag your player prefab here if it's not available yet. Now let's try to play the game and run as server. Nothing happens because this method is only getting called if a client joins. If you want to spawn an object for ourselves, let's say this server, we have to listen for another callbacks, which is onScene_Loaded. OnScene_Loaded meaning that the game is ready to use. Now, because onScene_Loaded can be called for both client and the server, we want to only spawn for the server. So we can use if.sandbox is server, we can use this. So if server, spawn the object. I'm just gonna copy paste in here, and then just be careful that we are adding a unnecessary namespace from the Unity. And however, there's another error here. This doesn't have the network player because we are spawning for a server that we know the network player is from. We can use sandbox dot local player. That's it. So basically, this will spawn the player for server if the server is us. So we don't want a client spawn the player character for server. We don't want client to spawn things. We only want server to spawn things. Now let's go back to Unity and let it compile. And then let's go back ahead, and there's error. Let's clean that up and click run server. When we run server, our game object is running here. And we can see there's a sandbox, which is server, and input source of local. So local means that this game object is ours. Now let's try to create a build to test out the server and client. So here we'll build a client. So let's try to click play here, and let's try to create a server. So our object has spawned here, and let's try to join this session using client. Let's click run client, and it says connected. And if we see on the game scene, there are two players that is going on. So we can see that here, the input source is local. As I said, it is ours. Meanwhile, for this player, it's owned by client 15. Client 15 is this client, and where do number 15 comes from? 15 comes from our settings here, which is the default is max player of 16. So 16 decreased by 1 is 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, and goes on. For this video, we have learned about spawning objects and starting sessions. Now, let's recap what we have done in this video. So we have learned about how to join sessions, learning about client and server connections, learning about transports, create a match manager, learning about network events, callbacks, and spawning a simple player character. Alright, see you guys in the next episode.